Thanks for joining us for today's workshop. My name is Van Guerra. I work for the Center of Sustainable Agricultural and Rural Advancement, known as SARA, here at the university. Our workshop today, To Be or Not to Be, is an introduction to beekeeping. Our guest speaker is Mr. Glenn Simpson. Mr. Simpson started beekeeping in 1967 as a 4-H project. And ever since then, he's had a lot of interest in beekeeping. Today, he runs his own operation here in the Rio Grande Valley, which he's been very successful at doing that the last 8 years. On behalf of the university, I'd like to thank Mr. Simpson in advance for being here and taking time out of his busy schedule and being here for this presentation. So at this time, I guess we can get this presentation going.
Hi, my name is Glenn Simpson, and I'm a beekeeper. I live in the Rio Grande Valley. I'd like to talk to you today about the life of honeybees, what it takes to become a beekeeper, and kind of touch on some of the various aspects of managing honeybees. It's a very complex thing to do, and it takes a while to actually learn all the aspects of beekeeping. We'll start today by discussing actually the life of the honeybee. You can see this graphic where it gives a little information there, but this is probably one of the most important things to learn about beekeeping. When the queen starts to lay the egg, the worker bees usually put a little bit of food in there and sometimes a little royal jelly for that egg, so when it hatches, it'll have something to eat. In the meantime, once the egg does hatch, the worker bees start filling that cell with all kinds of food, which is a mixture of honey and pollen, and it kind of ferments a little bit while they save it, so it makes what they call bee bread. And that bee bread is what the worker bees feed that larva when it hatches at about 4 days old. The larva will go ahead and grow for a while, and once the larva reaches the stage where it's ready to pupate, the worker bees will seal the cell with wax. It takes a while, about 11, 12 days for that larva to pupate into an adult bee. Honeybees have a certain order of things in which they work. At certain ages, they have certain jobs. The first job they have is to clean their room. They get the hive ready, or the actual cell they were hatched from. They clean it all out, and actually we call it polishing the cell, where they get that cell spotless and ready for the queen to lay an egg. Once they do that, they kind of grow into another stage where they're the nurse bee, and they work inside the hive, preparing food for the larva, feeding and taking care of the queen, and taking care of the drone bees, which can't take care of themselves. They just hang out in the hive and go out and fly around until they breed a queen. So the drones have to be taken care of by the nurse bees, or the bees that are about 24, 25 to, about 32 days old, somewhere in that neighborhood. They do all the work for the queen and the drones, along with feeding all the other bees. From that point on, their body kind of evolves into a certain stage where it produces wax. They have these little glands under the belly of the bee in their abdomen, and that starts to produce little flakes of wax, and the bees take that wax during that period of time, and they either form it into building new cells, or they'll use it to cap the brood that's getting ready to pupate. And that goes on for, maybe 6, 8 days until they graduate to the next stage and they get ready to go outside and do their jobs. The first stage they go through is becoming a guard bee. And that guard bee's job is to basically hang out around the entrance of the hive and protect the hive from invaders. That would be other insects. But down here, our biggest invader are other honeybees. We have Africanized bees that have been in this area since 1990, when they first hit the United States. And the guard bee's job is to prevent those bees from coming in and stealing their resources. Bees are very opportunistic, and they survive by getting food from wherever they can. Everybody thinks, oh, they go out and find flowers and they take it home, and that's part of it. But they also steal it from other beehives. They get it from Coke cans. They get it from any sugar source they can find. So the guard bee's job is to protect that front entrance from any other bees, mice, or other insects from coming inside that hive. Once they reach the stage of about 43 days, they are then graduated to become foragers. And what the forager bees do is their job is to go out and find food, like, pollen sources, find where something is blooming, and there's nectar sources. And they go back to the hive and they tell them where it is. They do a special little dance called a waggle dance, which tells the rest of the worker bees, and especially the forager bees, as to how far away that source is, what direction it is, and by how vigorously they dance, they inform the rest of the bees how good the source is, whether it's a lot of nectar or whether it's just a small group of plants that are blooming, but they communicate all this through a dance. The other thing the forager bees do is they actually go out and collect the nectar, collect the pollen, bring it back, but they look for other places to move to. When bees during the spring and summer get ready to swarm, that's how bees multiply. They don't multiply by the queen laying egg. That just adds more population to the colony. In order for the bee colony to multiply, they swarm. That's where the queen bee and about half of the worker bees, mostly the older worker bees, will move to a new location. Well, that forager bee is going to be going out and trying to find that location. And they go back and through something very similar to the waggle dance they use for food, they then find a location and use that to tell them where it is, and they go out and try to find it. Other bees go and inspect it. They come back and tell the hive, hey, this is a good place for us to move to. So then they decide, well, let's go check it out, and then they'll swarm. One of the important things when you start to become a beekeeper is you need to find a good location. Most of the time it's in your backyard that you want to start if you haven't been a beekeeper or if you don't live on a farm. But you need to find something where you've got a good place where there's not going to be a lot of problems with people or animals, but you'll also make sure you can access your hives. One of the most important things that beekeepers need to learn that they usually don't until they've made the mistake is they need to have access to the back of the hive. Proper bee etiquette tells us when we approach a hive, we do not approach from the front. The front of the hive is where the bees are coming and going. They're very busy. They don't need you blocking their entrance and getting in their way. They'll get a little cranky if you do that. They have a job and they want to do their job. Additionally, you have the guard bees sitting out there on the front porch, and their job is to keep things from blocking that entrance. So you really don't want to get the guard bees very grumpy. You want to be polite. So the best way is to walk up and look at your hive, but you have to have room behind it. So when you're finding a location, you want to make sure you have plenty of room behind it so that you can go around the back and then start to open the hive from the backside. And when you open a hive, you always want to take the lid off and open it away from you, because if you open it toward you and the bees are frightened, or if they're aggressive, let's say they have Africanized and you weren't aware of it, they'll fly right into your face, and that's a very bad experience. So you want to open the hive away from you and slowly move things around. We're going to talk about what kind of equipment you really need to get started. First thing is you have to have a stand. There are all kinds of crazy stands people tell you, and I like to keep it simple but solid. If you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, that's a picture of a stand that I actually use for my bees. I try to get it level and put some stepping stones and concrete blocks. And I use some either landscape timbers or 4x4s to put across. And an 8-foot 4x4 works out just right to put 4 or 5 hives on. If you're putting 10 frame hives, if you choose to go in the direction of using 10 frame boxes, which is what the majority of beekeepers do, you can put 4 10 frame hives on an 8-foot 4x4 and have room between them. If you go with the 8 frame hives, which I choose because I'm old and lifting a 10 frame full of honey is very heavy and I can handle an 8 frame, but 10 frame is just a little much anymore. I can put 5 8-frame hives on an 8-foot 4x4. But you don't have to do it like that. If you're having a single hive, you can see there's a couple different types of wood stands you can make, or you can actually buy these nice metal ones. There's one down there on the second row that actually is folding. Don't know that you need to fold it up and move it very often, but you can. The one on the right-hand side in the middle row is one that's very popular because it has a little rack on the side to put your frames so you don't lay them on the ground. Well, that's why I like the bench type, because I don't have to worry about that. I have some friends that have that type of stand that has the little frame hanger on it. And I keep hitting my shins on it. And to me, that's in the way. But they like it. And that's the one thing about beekeeping is you have to figure out what works for you and makes you happy. So you go with whatever type of stand you're more comfortable with. You have to make sure that it's very firm. You don't need the beehives to be moving or shaking. It needs to be very solid. The other reason I use the type stand in the upper left-hand corner is because I can take a ratchet strap and tie my hives and the concrete blocks and the 4x4s together, and it makes a very solid frame when we've got heavy winds and things like that. So you can actually learn from other beekeepers and look online and see what kind of stands that you like. And one of the most important parts of becoming a beekeeper is learn from everybody, but select what you find is the best for you. The next thing with a beehive, you've got to have a bottom board. Of course, there are 2 different choice types or styles, and there's also different reasons for going with either a solid bottom, which means it's just solid wood with a little frame to set your hive bodies on, or a screened bottom. The screened bottom board, I personally use both for different reasons and in different locations, but the screened bottom board is really designed to help with integrated pest management, with one of the biggest pests and most significant problems we have with bees, which is the Varroa Mite. I'll discuss the Varroa Mite a little later. One of the things, if you'll notice on both of these boards, is they have an entrance reducer. Now, what the screen does is that if the mites come loose from the bee, or if you treat the bees, the dead mites will fall off. If the bees are cleaning themselves, they're performing different hygienic behaviors, they actually will pull the mites off of the other bees. Well, the mites don't fly, they just crawl. If they hit the solid bottom board, there's still a live mite inside your hive, and as the other bees are crawling around on that solid bottom board, they'll attach themselves to the bee and just go back up into the hive, and they start sucking the fat from the bees and also the larvae. The idea of the screen is that if the bees pull them off of each other, they'll fall through that screen, either onto the ground, or you can have a board in there. We use a plastic board that goes in underneath the screen. And sometimes we'll put like spray glue, just kind of a sticky substance. Some people use Vaseline, and the mites will stick to it. So you can actually get an idea what's going on if you've got a lot of mites that are falling off. But the other reason I use the screen bottom boards down here is that it helps with ventilation because it gets very hot, and sometimes it gets so hot your bees will go outside. So it helps give you some ventilation. Both of these bottom boards show the entrance reducer. The entrance reducer is very important. If you just leave the bottom completely open without having control of the size of the entrance, it takes a lot more guard bees to protect it. You've got a lot more area for pests, other bees, mice, roaches to crawl in. So different times of the year, you'll either have the medium entrance, which is the one on the left-hand side. You see there's about a 3.5, 4-inch slot. And then the winter time, when you don't have a lot of guard bees and the bees aren't producing as much brood, I use the small slot, which is a little over a 1/2 inch wide, about 3/8 inch tall. So it really limits the access. Some people say, well, gosh, aren't you limiting your access to your whole hive and the bees can't come and grow? Well, I also do bee removals. I've removed bees out of a wall where they were 8 feet tall, 3 sections of 16 inches wide, full of bees, full of brood. And some people think that the small hole will restrict the access of the bees to their hive. I do bee removal sometimes, and I've removed bees that were in a wall that was 8 feet tall and 3 sections about 16 inches wide, full of comb and bees and honey. And there were probably about 15 to 20,000 bees coming and going in that wall. And they were all accessing that through a hole that was about the size of my finger. So there is something to be said about having enough access so you reduce the congestion. That has more to do with making sure the bees have access so they don't really want to swarm. But during the winter time and times when you don't need that access, it's a good idea to reduce the entrance and to help protect your bees. This shows different parts of the beehive. You've got the bottom board, you've got the deep super, which is mostly used for brood. In this area, I like to have nice, strong brood boxes. So I usually use a double deep so that I've got plenty of room for the queen to lay eggs and for them to develop brood. And during the spring, summer, and fall, I keep both boxes on. In the fall, the bees will start reducing the amount of eggs the queen lays. And so then when they get down to where they don't need 2 deep boxes, I'll remove one of them and save it for next year to put it back on. Above the brood box, you have a queen excluder. And what this is, it's a little mesh screen that is big enough for the worker bees to go through, but the queen bee can't crawl through it. The whole idea of that is that when you're extracting honey, you don't want to have bee larvae, you don't want to have the cocoons that the bees make when they're pupating. You want to keep your honey as clean as possible. So that keeps the queen in the lower boxes to produce brood. And then it keeps your honey boxes where they're clean and pristine and you have a really nice honey. It's really a problem if you have brood mixed in with your honey when you extract it. It can cause your honey to go bad. It can cause it to ferment. There's moisture issues and health issues that you really don't want to deal with. So when you're producing honey, you really want to have the queen excluder to separate your brood boxes from your honey boxes. Now, a lot of people don't do it. They just stack enough boxes that the queen won't go that high, and that's another way to approach it. But personally, I prefer having it where I have some control over the honey supers. The last super that you see on there, it has these little circles. Those are called a Ross round. It's designed and created by a man with the last name of Ross, obviously. But those produce comb honey, and there's a good market for comb honey. I know one beekeeper that actually takes his regular honey, he even extracts it and then feeds it back to the bees in order to make comb honey. People love getting those chunks of comb, and the Ross rounds allow you to produce the comb honey without even having to touch it. So you don't have to cut the comb and put it in a container. It has a little cassette that all you do is pop it out of that frame and put the covers on it and a label, and it's ready to sell. Above the last super, you'll see an inner cover. And what this is that it's there to help with ventilation and in some cases moisture control, but mostly ventilation. And to also, I find that it helps when you open the hive, when you take the top off, it doesn't shock the bees. It allows you to take the top off, allow a little bit of light in and everything so that the bees aren't really shocked and immediately get on alert because you've just opened their hive. So it helps keep them calm a little bit too, I think. But the whole idea of it was originally for additional ventilation. In the valley, that's really important. The next thing is the tools. You can never have too many tools as a beekeeper, but there's some that are essential. The Hive Tools, which in the upper left-hand corner, I've got some different Hive Tools. I keep both Hive Tools available. They have different shapes and do different things when you're taking the frames out, when you're scraping propolis off of the frames, when you're trying to loosen them. So I like to have both of these types of tools available. The frame grip, which you see is silver in the upper left-hand corner, and there's a yellow one in the right-hand corner. This is what I like to use because it has this little extra screwdriver shaped tip on it. And that's very helpful when you're opening your hive and you get into it and you're moving the frames back and forth so that you can loosen them and then take them out with the grip. And the reason I like the grip is I don't mash or squeeze any bees. When you squeeze the bees, you'll get some alert, that alert pheromone, because they're afraid you just hurt them and they're going to be defensive. Well, that'll trigger the other bees to not be very happy and come to defend it. Once that happens, sometimes, especially Africanized bees, will go into a frenzy to protect their home. The upper right-hand corner, you see the smoker, and you can see one on the table here to the left.
Yeah, it's good to go.
You really need to have a smoker. A lot of my bees that I have, I order queens from areas that produce very gentle queens. On those hive, I may not even need the smoker, but to get the smoker lit when you do need it can take some time, and you don't want to get into a hive and suddenly find out they've swarmed and the queen's been replaced with an Africanized bees, and you need to try to do something to calm those bees down and not have your smoker lit. You really need to light the smoker before you start and hope you don't even have to use it through the whole time you inspect your hives. The lower left-hand corner has a couple little plastic tools that are very helpful. The queen clip, which you see that there are fingers right there holding the queen clip, that is used to catch the queen and keep her safe so that she doesn't get hurt when you're moving frames around. If you see her and you're going to be working in that hive, moving a lot of frames, sometimes it's a good idea to just catch her in that little clip, catch her gently, and then put her over to the side out of the sun, but where the other bees can get to her, and they'll group around that clip and keep her safe. They'll feed her, keep her cool, give her water, and basically take care of her. And you've got a lot less chance of actually damaging that queen when she's in that clip. The only thing is you have to be careful when you catch the queen that you don't damage her. But with a little practice, you'll be fine. The other little plastic thing beside the queen clip is a little tube. Now, we tend to mark our queens, and by marking them, we put a colored dot on their thorax. And there's a convention worldwide that determines what color dot is for what year. The reason we use the dot, most people think it is so we can find the queen easier, and it does help. But the importance of the dot is to tell you what year that queen was born, so that when you inspect the hive, it gives you two important pieces of information when you see her. It tells you how old the queen is, and it also tells you that that's the queen you put in there. If you don't mark the queen and you open a hive and you find the queen, but the hive is really grumpy and you don't have it marked, it may have been the queen you put there and the bees may just be having a bad day. Or it could be the hive has swarmed and they've requeened themselves, and that new queen bred with an Africanized drone, and you now have Africanized bees. In that case, you definitely need to replace that queen as soon as possible. It'll take about 60 to 90 days for a generation of bees to turn over to replace those Africanized bees. So marking a queen is very important, especially for hobby beekeepers. Commercial beekeepers just go in and replace the queen once a year anyway, whether she's marked or not. And it's a bit different with beginning beekeepers and with hobby beekeepers, that we really need to keep a tighter monitoring hand on what's going on in our hive.
Yeah, they shouldn't bother you too bad in there because you've got it all tucked down in there. You're good.
Personal protective gear. I've put some up here. To me, I decide what I'm going to wear depending on the bees that I'm going to work. I always recommend that somebody wear a veil. Even if you don't wear the jacket, you need to wear a veil because there may be a stray bee that's not even from that particular colony that you're working that will attack you, that will get defensive. It could be a bee that's trying to steal the resources. We call them a robber bee. And they'll tend to be a bit more aggressive sometimes than the bees you're actually working. So I suggest that you always wear a veil. If you're working bees that you don't know, especially here in the Rio Grande Valley, there's a really good chance that they are Africanized. And that's where you need a full suit, you need boots, you need gloves, and you need duct tape to tape it all together so that the bees cannot get inside your suit. The rubber boots are a good idea, especially if you're doing bee removals, because the honey's always dripping down on your suit and your shoes, and you don't want it really soaking into your shoes. So a lot of us that do bee removals wear rubber boots. Sometimes, we just wear tennis shoes if they're the bees in our backyard that we know very well. A lot of people wear the heavy-duty leather or lambskin gloves that go all the way up to your elbows. They have very long gauntlets to help protect your sleeves. If you're working and doing bee removals, those are probably a good idea. But if you're working your bees in your backyard or in your hobby apiary, the nitrile gloves work wonderfully. They're not thick enough to prevent you from being stung. The stinger of a bee can sting right through it, but the bees don't like it. They don't even like to walk on it. So unless you actually squeeze a bee or mash a bee with your fingers, it's a really good chance they're not going to sting you. So I like the nitrile gloves because I have a much better feel. When I touch something, I don't have to guess what it is. The sensation or tactile experience is much better with the nitrile gloves. So that's something that's going to be a personal preference. As all this is, you just have to develop the idea of what works for you. The pests, the primary pest, number one killer of bees is the Varroa mite. Its name is Varroa destructor, and that Varroa destructor is a very well-earned name. They don't actually kill the bee themselves. They suck the fat out of the bee. They're a mite, eight-legged creature that crawls around. They get on the larva. They start feeding off of the larva as it grows. As the larva pupates, they suck the fat out of that pupa. And then they breed in that closed cell. They reproduce in there. The female mite will lay eggs in there, and as it's sealed, they actually hatch and multiply inside the sealed cell as the bees are pupating. When they emerge, they have some mites on them. Some mites stay in the cell, but they'll crawl out of the cell and go to other cells. Something interesting about Varroa mite, when a female starts to lay eggs in a new cell, the first one she lays will be a male. And then she lays a lot of other eggs, and those will all be females. When they hatch, that way, if they hatch and they're mature, they'll breed inside the cell, but they'll be sure and be able to lay eggs as soon as they get out of there and go into other cells. Part of the problem isn't that they actually kill the bee by sucking the fat. What they do is they weaken the bee. And you have so many of them, they'll weaken the entire colony. When the colony is weak, they can't defend themselves against other pests. They can't defend themselves against robber bees. They don't grow very fast. They can't fly very far to get food. So you'll start to see your hive decline. The other thing they do is they also carry viruses. And they'll give the bees what's called a deformed wing virus, which is one of the ones they carry and they give. But what happens is when the larva hatches, they're still kind of weak, but their wings don't develop where they can fly. So eventually, you'll have a lot of young bees flying around with no wings. They get to be a guard bee, but they can't be an actual field bee. They can't go out and gather resources. They can't fly. If that's what happens, then you're going to lose your colony. That means they're already dead. They just haven't all died off yet, but the colony itself will not exist anymore. So the Varroa mite is our number one pest, and that has been a significant cause of what they call the disease that has basically been getting rid of the bees, the colony collapse disorder. Basically, you'll find that the Varroa mite is at the root of almost all the collapsed colonies. Well, how do we treat them? How do we deal with them? Well, there are a few things that have been tried. There are some poisons that they've developed that you can actually put in the hive that kill the mites. There's also an organic acid, oxalic acid, which will also kill the mites. And what you do is you use a device that sublimates the vapors into the hive, and that vapor coats the cells and coats the bees, and it doesn't hurt the bees. Oxalic acid is something that we get every time we eat a green vegetable. In fact, somebody was telling me if you have 2 servings of carrots, you just ate enough oxalic acid to treat an entire colony for Varroa mites. But when it's in its vapor form, it's very hard on you. You really need to wear a respirator and eye protection when you're using it, because the vapor from oxalic acid is very corrosive and it can cause some damage. So you have to be careful using it. The other thing that is very popular right now and that I also use is called Apivar. And it's basically a strip that you put in the hive. This is where choosing the right method at the right time is important, because during the summertime, when you've got a very high population of bees, the vapor doesn't flow as well and doesn't coat the cells or the bees because there's congestion going on. There's a lot of bees, so things don't flow. And the vapor is only there for just a few seconds, so you have to get good coverage. But the strips, the Apivar strips, rubs off on the bees, and the bees themselves carry it throughout the hive. So the rule of thumb is during the summer and early fall is a good time to use the Apivar or some of the other types of mite miticides because the bees themselves actually spread it. But during the late fall, winter, and early spring, it tends to be more successful by using the oxalic acid in one of the vaporizers or sublimators. There's one there on your lower left. It gets the cup to a certain temperature, which will cause the crystals to sublimate instantly. And you put it into the hive and you turn it over and it dumps oxalic acid in it. It sublimates immediately and just coats the entire hive. So that's one of your biggest pests and your biggest problem is the Varroa destructor. There's a lot of information about that. And one of the things I recommend that everybody do is become familiar with the Honeybee Health Coalition. They've done a lot of research. They maintain the most recent publications on how to handle many pests, but especially the Varroa mite. They have an excellent resource center on what to do and how to handle Varroa. So the Honeybee Health Coalition online is an excellent source of information. A couple of secondary pests are the small hive beetle, which you see on the top row, and the waxworm, which you see on the bottom row. The small hive beetle is named, its actual name is small hive beetle, because there's other hive beetles. There's a large hive beetle and there's other types of hive beetles, but the small hive beetle is the ones that's the biggest problem. They usually get into your hive when you don't have enough bees to protect the space that you had in the hive. So once again, you'll hear me talk about keeping your hive strong, keeping your space appropriate for the number of bees you have to maintain it. If you have too much space, the small hive beetles will get into the pollen and nectar that the bees have stored, and they'll start to reproduce and they'll get out of hand. Once they get out of hand and they get a lot of larvae, that the larvae will eat the honey and they produce a slime on their body. And once your comb has been slimed, the bees don't want to touch it. The bees won't even go back and use it. You basically have to get rid of it and start again with new comb. Or you can take the foundation and clean it and then coat the foundation with wax so the bees will start afresh and use that. The hive beetles are a real big nuisance. So keep your hive strong to avoid hive beetles. The waxworms are basically, they're kind of like the mortician of the hive. Once the hive is either dead or dying, the bees can't defend themselves against the wax moths that come in and lay the eggs. And they basically just destroy the wax, and they actually burrow into the wood and they make these cocoons. And it's a real mess to clean up a hive once it's been invaded with waxworms. But if you see waxworms in your hive and you still have bees and your queen's still laying eggs, you need to do something immediately to take care of that hive. You need to reduce the amount of space. In other words, if you have a lot of supers on there, you need to take the supers off. You need to just keep the space with food and brood that the bees can defend and they can take care of it. So just remove the extra space in the hive. And the same is true for the small hive beetles. Make sure that you keep your space appropriate for the amount of bees you have to defend it. So that's the biggest step, is trying to keep a small, your hive appropriate. If when your brood and population is small, keep the space small. When you've got a real strong population and there's plenty of resources and the bees are growing, that's when you add the brood boxes and you add honey supers. One of the things I wanted to mention today is that if we're actually making a little money off of this hobby. People always want honey. They think that, well, if I've got bees, I'm going to make some money. I'm going to sell the honey. Well, I'll tell you from my experience, 2 hives is not enough to produce enough honey more than what my family will consume. So There's a certain scale you have to reach in order to produce enough honey to sell it, recover your operating costs, some return on your investment, and actually put a little money in your pocket. But it's also very rewarding to see that you've made your hive survive the winter, get into the spring, help take care of them to where they're producing honey, and you have something to sell. It's really an amount of pride that you get from that. So honey production is great. To actually make money off of selling honey, there's a certain scale you have to achieve. And from just a rule of thumb is about 20 to 30 hives will actually give you revenue adequate to actually make some decent profit off of it. So, you know, having a couple hives in the backyard that's really all I wanted to do when I retired, but I became addicted to raising bees, so I failed retirement, and I now actually have a pretty good sized bee business. Another way to make money with the bees is for doing pollination, and it's actually a bit more lucrative. Farmers will pay you anywhere from $50 to $150 per hive, depending on the crop, depending on how strong your hives are, and depending on where they're located. In the Rio Grande Valley, we have a lot of cucurbits, or vegetables like watermelons, cucumbers, squash, things like that, that really depend on honeybees for pollination. There are other secondary crops which they actually increase production from the pollinators, but it's not critical. So in that kind of situation, if you talk a farmer into paying you to put it on those crops, you're not going to make as much money, but they usually produce a lot of good nectar, where the cucurbits don't produce a lot of nectar. You're just making the money from the pollination, so there's no residual income from nectar on those crops. So if you have bees and you've got a way to transport them, and you can line up several different farmers at different stages of growth and different crops, different locations through the spring and summer, you can actually do quite well, because each time you move them, it's a new contract with that farmer, and that farmer will pay you to keep those bees anywhere from 28 to 40, 50 days, depending on the crop on that site. But then when you're through, you get your money and your bees are ready to go to the next site. So with a little bit of planning, you can make quite a bit of money on that. It's really a very profitable way. In fact, in the United States, the primary source of revenue for honeybees is from pollination. That's what keeps the bee industry alive. It's not from selling honey. Another way, if you're in this area and you like to wrangle bees, is doing bee removals. That's also another source of income, but it's dangerous. You really need to have quite a few years of bee management under your belt before you really launch into that. It can be dangerous, and you can have a lot of failures. Even the best bee remover is going to have between a 50 to 75% success rate in getting the bees to stay, getting them to survive. And then you have additional costs because you have to requeen that hive to get them to where they're manageable. You don't really want to put Africanized bees on a pollination field, because the farmer's not going to be happy when you've got the bees chasing their workers off the tractors. So you really have to go back and requeen once you get them established. So there's many different ways to make money with beekeeping, many of which require a lot of work, require employees, require a lot of time, but it can be very rewarding. So as a beekeeper, you have to decide, number one, whether you want to make money at doing it, or if you just want to do it as a hobby and enjoy it. And believe me, there's a lot of joy in doing this. Whether you want to try to get a little bit of revenue off of it, or whether you really want to do it as a business, and it can become a full-time business. What do we need to do to be a successful beekeeper? Well, it's all in your heart. It's all what makes you happy. This is when I was first starting out. This is my first removal. I didn't have an extractor. I didn't have a lot of equipment to bottle honey. So I made what I needed and it worked. I got a lot of really good experience. If all you're going to have is 2 or 3 hives, 4 or 5 hives, I really don't think you need to go through the expense of buying an extractor. You can actually remove the honey, remove the caps, generate a little extra wax from the caps that you remove, but you don't have to destroy the cells. And that's an important thing too when you're extracting honey, is you want to try to maintain the honeycomb intact as best you can so that the bees don't have to build it again. But to be a successful beekeeper, you really need to look at what you want to do and what makes you satisfied, what makes you happy about doing it. And there's many rewarding aspects of it. One thing I suggest is that you learn as much as you can from as many people as you can. Be careful of what you learn on the internet. I think the most dangerous individual in beekeeping is the second-year beekeeper that's putting out YouTube videos. You'll never be successful if your only source of information comes from YouTube University. You really need to find beekeepers and work with them. You need to go to hands-on classes, and I say classes, not just, oh, I went to a beekeeping class, so now I'm a beekeeper. I see that all the time. And then they wonder why their bees died. There's a lot to it. It takes experience. So go to several classes. It's worth making the investment, because in order to get started, you're going to need to have all the equipment we looked at. You're going to need to order bees, whether you get them as a package, which is just bees and a queen, and you put them in a beehive and they have to build their own comb and everything, or whether you order a nucleus or a nuke. This year I sold over 60 nukes to just local beekeepers here and helped them get started, and where I'm still working with all of them to become beekeepers. What a nuke is you get about 5 frames of brood with an active queen that's laying eggs, and she's already been accepted, and they have some resources. But yet you actually have a living colony. So all they have to do is just expand the colony they have. So that's a real good way to get started. But that's still a lot of investment, a lot of time. And you really need to do that in conjunction with doing hands-on work with other beekeepers and getting some hands-on classes with other beekeepers and instructors. So decide what you really want out of beekeeping, and it's going to change. You may change later, 2-3 years from now, and decide, well, I'd really like to become a honey producer. At that point, you may want to take the steps and buy an electric extractor and bottling equipment, things like that. But there are ways to do it and to actually achieve that goal on a smaller scale without spending a lot of money. There's a big investment there. So decide what you want, stay flexible, learn what you can, and put the time in. Be sure you're happy. Be sure you enjoy it. Don't get into it and realize there's a lot of work, because it takes a lot of time. But get into beekeeping to enjoy it, to watch the bees grow, and you'll be amazed just how successful you'll be with a little time and patience and practice. So I hope everybody learned something, and keep up the good ideas, keep things coming, ask a lot of questions, and don't be afraid to contact local beekeepers. I hope you enjoyed what you learned, and I hope you'll find satisfaction in becoming a beekeeper. Don't be afraid to approach beekeepers and ask them if they'll help you, because we're all very proud of what we do. You'll find very few beekeepers that really don't want to share and talk with you about what they do. It's a very enjoyable experience. So don't be afraid to ask questions. You can get hold of me anytime you want. If there's any way I can help, please let me know. Take care.
Thank you everyone for joining this webinar, and thank you to Mr. Simpson for the great information that he provided on this video. We're gonna turn the time now to Mr. Simpson. So whoever that wants to ask him a question, please feel free to open your mic and ask Mr. Simpson a question. Is anybody has a question?
Yeah, I got a question real quick. I was noticing that in one of those videos you had a pretty nice lawn. How are bees with lawnmowers and weed eaters?
Well, it depends on the bees. You have to realize that the European bees have been selected for thousands of years to accept human behavior and not be as defensive as their counterparts that we have down here, the Africanized bees. The Africanized bees have been selected for thousands of years by nature and being able to survive. So what they view as a threat, the European bees may not. For the Africanized bees actually react to a lot of things like noises and sounds that are unfamiliar to them, vibrations, hitting their home, beating their hives up with rocks and things that kids do sometimes. So it all depends on the kind of bees you have. The bees that you would want to raise in a colony would obviously be the European bees, but the Africanized bees came into the Rio Grande Valley in 1990 in Westaco, Texas. We were the first place in the US that they entered. So most of our feral bees are going to be Africanized. So we have to be careful with the feral bees that we have.
I'll ask another question. So since you're saying that in South Texas, the feral bees might be Africanized, where would we buy European bees at?
Well, what I do is I buy queens from areas that are outside the Africanized area. And then I wash my hives very carefully and I replace the queens that are, after they swarm, they'll make their own queen and those queens will breed with Africanized drones. So I buy queens from other areas that I've known that to function really well with the heat, and they're defensive enough to fight off the robber bees, but they're not so defensive that they won't let you work the hive. So you have to actually buy known genetics and maintain your hive with known genetics. The best way to start, in my opinion, is to buy a nuke. It's short for nucleus hive or a nucleus colony, which you get 5 frames with a proven queen that's laying, and you have known genetics there where she came from. And they've got a bit of an advantage because they already have their social structure in place. They have their guard bees and field bees already functioning, where if you buy a package of bees, you get a queen and a bunch of bees, but they really haven't established a home and you don't have any brood to replace the worker bees that'll die off for about 21 to 40 something days before you actually have a functioning colony. So you have to buy your bees or your nukes from someone that's outside, with the genetics come from outside the Africanized area.
How far will bees travel to collect pollen and bring back to their hive?
Typically, it's about a 3-mile radius. So you can, but there have been times, there's documentation where they've gone 5 or 6 miles, but they primarily look within a 3-mile radius. It takes a lot of work for a bee once they're loaded with nectar or pollen to fly back to the hive. So, and that's the last job the bee has in its life cycle, is to be a field bee or a guard bee. So there's a lot that can happen to them. The further they are, the longer they're flying, the greater the chance that a bird's going to get them, or that their wings are just wearing out and they just die on their way back. So about 3 miles radius is what's pretty much accepted that bees collect their food within that area.
What's the best local forage around here for bees?
Wow, that's a great question. Our native plants here have evolved in a moderate desert climate. So their blooming cycles tend to be linked to rainfall. A lot of the trees around here, like Anaqua and the ebonies and some of the others, tend to bloom right after a good heavy rain. If you have a wet year, you get a lot of nectar. If you have a dry year, you don't get as much nectar. But if you're looking to plant things to help supplement the bees' diet, I encourage everybody to plant things like our native goldenrod and some of the other plants that are the very last plants of the season to bloom, because the bees need to have the nutrition to make it through the winter. So instead of doing a lot of landscaping plants or plants that bloom and flowers that bloom when everything else is blooming, typically there's plenty of that out there already. But if we want to help increase plants to help the bees, plant something that blooms very early or something that blooms very late. So I know I didn't give you specifics. I can go down a whole list of them, but that's really the main thing, is to look at when the plants that you're planting are going to bloom. I believe there was another question.
When is the best time to like take the weeds away from the beehives? Like, is it in the morning or in the afternoon, or how do you get rid of the weeds around the beehives?
Well, you have to basically look at when the bees are going to be coming and going. In the morning, the bees are primarily just going out to find food or to gather nectar from where they were getting it from the previous day. So there aren't going to be a lot of bees coming and going there in the colony. So it's a good time to get out and pull weeds or scratch around the hives to get rid of the weeds. Midday, you're going to have traffic coming and going, and you don't want to get in their way. Other than the Africanized bees, if you have a managed colony of European genetics, they're not going to be as upset with you for being around the hive, but they're still not going to want you to get in their way of their entrance. That's the most important thing. I mentioned bee etiquette. One of the things that you want to do when you're working around the hive is to not stand in front of the entrance, because they're coming and going. They want to get their load delivered to the hive. They want to get back out in the field to go get some more as quick as they can. So bees will get a little fussy if you're standing in front of it and they're getting congested behind you trying to get to their hive. So during the midday, there's a lot of coming and going. And then in the late afternoon, sometimes usually between 3 and 5 o'clock, you'll see a bunch of bees coming back to your hive. And that's the girls coming home from work. The ones that have been in all different areas are all coming home to get ready for the night. And there'll be some significant congestion. So I prefer the early morning, but you can work around them during the day without a whole lot of trouble, as long as you don't disrupt their flight path.
We have strong southwest winds all the time. In an open field, is there a suggestion of where to put the box, either on the north side or the south side or east or west? That way they don't fight the wind with a load or go with the load with the wind.
Yeah, that's always a difficult question to answer down here. One thing you don't want to do is have them facing north or northwest, because then when the cold comes through, air just blows right inside the hive and it'll damage your bees. But when the bees are coming in from the south, it's usually pretty good, but you're going to have wind blowing into the hive. It's still better, my experience is to have bees coming and going from the south or southeast. One of the things down here that we have to be kind of conscious of is that late afternoon hot sun. So you want to try to make sure if you can, it's not necessary, but I believe that it helps, is to have some kind of trees or vegetation that's going to block that late afternoon sun. A lot of beekeepers don't want any vegetation around their hives at all to affect their flight. I don't want anything really close. I want to make sure there's plenty of space for the bees to fly and not have their flight path interrupted. But having them face south and southeast and a tree or something on the west side usually tends to help.
Do you have any book suggestions on the different forage that would be suitable for down here for the bees?
Wow, that's one of the things we've been trying to get started, get some research to actually have a publication that will help the new beekeepers to have a reference they can go to say, okay, this time of year we typically have this plant group or this plant community that blooms, and they produce a lot of nectar. During another time of year, it's this particular type of plants. But one of the things that I learned when I moved to South Texas is that we have a lot of plants that produce pollen. We are very heavy pollen producers, but our plants down here don't necessarily produce a lot of nectar. Just because a flower is blooming doesn't mean it produces nectar. So we really need some research. We need some support to help us know what plants produce nectar down here and what plants are just pollen producers and the window in which they typically bloom. I know Florida puts out a publication quarterly for the different parts of Florida, separates the state into 3 different areas. And they put out a publication that based on what has happened the previous quarter with rainfall and temperatures to what the beekeepers can expect in their particular zone to be blooming for the next quarter. That's a terrific publication they do. But we don't seem to have anything like that right now. I'd be happy just if we had something that was a bit more general to start with, of a book or a reference material to find out that information.
What are your thoughts about putting a beehive in a high tunnel for pollination?
Well, it depends on the size of the high tunnel. You'd want to have some, you don't want to completely be enclosed because the bees will need to come and go and they'll need more food than what you're going to produce in a high tunnel. But you will actually increase the concentration of them pollinating within that high tunnel. I have been communicating with a friend of mine that actually owns a couple high tunnels, and he thought he'd order some bumblebees to release in his high tunnel to do the pollination. Well, apparently the bumblebees he was ordering are not the same type of bumblebees we have down here, and they don't even want to come out of the little colony that he was sent. So he talked to the company. So there's something wrong. We'll send you another. Well, same thing. He didn't get the bumblebees to come out. At the time, it sounded like a good solution for it. So you can use it. You don't want to have it all sealed up for the bees, where the bees can't get out and get other resources, because they're definitely going to need more than the food and water they'll get inside the hive tunnel. But it will increase your pollination.
Thank you.
Okay, Glenn. Seems like we don't have any other question. So we thank you again for all the great information that was presented here and for taking the time to be with us today.